Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated economist here. So I'm going to keep beating a dead horse and talking about the Federal Reserve's average inflation rate. This is something that everybody is missing. Now, if you have followed me on my channel for any length of time, you have heard me talk about average inflation rate. And this is something that the Federal Reserve has switched to. Everybody believes that the Fed is going for a 2% inflation target. But they have changed the way that they do things. And they no longer go for a 2% target, but go for a 2% average inflation rate over time. And get this, they have no mathematical formula for figuring out average inflation rate over time, which to me left it very arbitrary to the Federal Reserve to say, hey, we've met our 2% inflation goal. They could just make it up whenever they wanted. But then I realized, no, that's not the case. It's not set to any mathematical formula because there is a place in history in which that there was a 2% average inflation. Okay? So now think about it like this for just a moment. The Federal Reserve is not going for a 2% target. Typically, when the people would look at the Fed and say, hey, inflation is running hot, the Federal Reserve would then adjust their monetary policy to begin to make it restrictive in order to bring that inflation back down to the 2% target. If it ran under 2%, again, they would adjust monetary policy to try and make it more accommodating and then bring inflation back up to the 2% and then go for that target. Anything from the history was just left to be bygones, right? And they would always go for this 2% target. This is the way like 99% of the people see it. This is the way that they used to conduct themselves. Remember that. It used to be that way. They have completely changed the way that they view inflation targeting. They no longer go for an 2% target, like they're trying to achieve that. They're going for a 2% average inflation rate over time, and then give us no mathematical formula for figuring this out. Listen to this. This is coming out of the Richmond Fed. And now this is, again, if you have followed me for any length of time on this channel, you have heard me say all this information before, but I got something that just dawned on me earlier today when I was thinking about this and going through the information. But this is how it goes. Significant date is September of 2020 when the FOMC revised its statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategy. In this update, the FOMC adopted flexible average inflation targeting, seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and stated that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. As in Figure 1 shows, as Figure 1 shows, I'll leave the link down in the description to this. Since the revised statement was released, headline PCE inflation has run at a pace of 5% per year, and core inflation has run at a pace of 4.4% per year on average. Notably, this is really important right here. I'm going to try and get through this information and get to the point here, all right? Notably, it is in its update, the FOMC did not define the window of time over which it would be looking back to assess progress towards its goal. Get that. Okay? This is important to understand. The FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, the people who set monetary policy, the people who are looking for a 2% average inflation rate over time, did not define the window of time over which it would be looking back to assess progress towards its inflation goal. By looking back far enough, it is possible to identify a starting date where average inflation through present day has come in exactly at target. So think about that for just a second. We can look at today's date, all right, and we can say inflation is something today, all right, and we're going to say it's just whatever, right? I'm making up a number. We're going to say 5% today, all right, no matter when we're using this example. We go back a year, right? No, it's still too hot. It was like we had extra hot inflation last year, so nope, there's no 2% average inflation yet. That's more like, 6 or 7% average. We take it back 2 years, not quite there, we're still at 5% average. Go back 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and we find an average inflation rate of 2%. according to what inflation is today, incorporating all the previous inflation that we have had, either the rise in inflation or the shortfalls in inflation, we have to go all the way back 15 years in order to find an average inflation rate of 2%. This is very important to understand. Let me continue to read this. All right. For example, Figure 1 shows that when considering inflation from October of 2008 to August of 2023, headline PCE inflation averaged about 2% per year on average, right on target. So now, when we think about this for just a moment here, right, because this is where it gets really critical. I did this video and I noticed that a lot of people within the comment section still did not seem to understand what it was that I was trying to get through to in that video, right? Because imagine this, if we had inflation that has run hot, incorporating that extra hot inflation along with the shortfalls that have taken place within inflation over the last few years, we have to take all this incorporated extra hot inflation and go back 15 years in order to find a 2% average inflation rate. Now we have something that we can look at. This is 2% average. If, for example, inflation had run even hotter, well, it wouldn't be back 15 years. It may be back, say, 13 years or 10 years, depending on how hot inflation had run. And if inflation continues to run hot, it will start bringing that inflation closer to the present date, the average inflation rate. You understand? So let's do that again. If right now, if you were to take all the inflation that we have experienced over the last, few years, and you have the shortfalls that took place in inflation prior to the pandemic, right? The Fed had problems getting up to their 2% inflation target. So now what they have is a 2% average inflation that occurred over the course of 15 years. If inflation has run hotter than it has right now, that 15 years would have been a shorter time span, as the added inflation that we have experienced would make up for the shortfalls that have taken place prior to the pandemic. Is this starting to make sense a little bit? So if inflation is running extra hot, extra long for an extended period of time, it's going to make up for the shortfall of inflation failing to achieve the 2% target for the decade prior. This is important to understand, because if inflation continues to run hot above the 2% target, right? If it runs hot, then what's going to happen is this date's going to get ever shorter and closer to the present day, until eventually, right? Because if it stays hot, then it's going to go from 15 years to 12 years to 10 years, and eventually it's going to reach a date in which that there is no time between the present time today, or in the future, the present time in the future, to that particular date where there would be an average inflation rate of 2%. It will cease to be in existence there. It's an inflection point. Now, what happens after this, we are going to discuss in a live stream later tonight. Now, if you join the membership, which is $1 a month, it's literally nothing to you, but it's everything to me. You are going to get all the information that I have found on average inflation. I'm going to put it down in the description of not only this video, but I'm going to put it in the description of the live stream that we are going to do. We are going to cover all this, and then we're going to talk about what it is that the Federal is going to do once it meets that inflection point. Because this is going to be a very critical moment. See, the Fed is no longer targeting out there no more, right? There's an average inflation rate that has occurred sometime in the past, and if the inflation today remains elevated, that time period is eventually going to move up and meet that inflection point in which that something needs to be done or something is going to happen. And what that is, again, we are going to discuss later tonight in that live stream. It's going to be about 5 o'clock Pacific time. I will leave a link down in the description of this video to that live stream. Uneducated economist. You guys let me know.